Very briefly, we're working off a theme, examining a statement by historian Thurman Arnold, that great constructive achievements in human organization have been accomplished by unscrupulous men who violated most of the principles which we cherish. And as I indicated last week, this course will really thrive in the world of chaos. Joseph Schumpeter, a great economist, once said, "Economic progress in capitalist society means turmoil," and it does. Last week we examined the background of John D. Rockefeller. This is the second talk on John D. Rockefeller. I call it Anaconda. There was an exquisite disconnect between John D. Rockefeller's business life and his personal life. Rockefeller was in the oil business. It was by nature a chaotic business. When it was discovered that oil could be flushed from the ground in Titusville, Pennsylvania, by use of a derrick, there ensued a rush akin to that of the gold rush in California. People from all walks of life descended on Titusville. Factory workers, ranch hands, school teachers, sailors, mechanics, farmers, plumbers, many men from the ranks of the unemployed. They descended in droves upon the town and its environs to get in on the speculation. Remember, prior to that, the oil which came out of the ground was something which Rockefeller's father sold as a patent medicine. They didn't know what to do with it, but now they discovered. Jerry-built hotels, saloons, gambling halls, and whorehouses, not necessarily in that order, sprang up overnight. The hillsides in and around Titusville, which was soon renamed Oil City, were blanketed with oil rigs built in no discernible pattern. Since it was perfectly legal to place a rig on your property and then drill horizontally onto the adjoining property if your neighbor had hit oil, brutal fights, both legal and physical, were common among the wildcatters, adding even more to the confusion. The result of all this chaos was a total breakdown in the so-called invisible hand, which Adam Smith, in his Wealth of Nations, had hypothesized would naturally balance the supply and demand for product. When discoveries were made, speculators flocked to the area of the discovery and supply mushroomed. And then demand would be fulfilled, and between the discoveries of the gushers, supply would dwindle. The price of oil naturally fluctuated wildly during these hills and valleys of supply and demand. Rockefeller had emerged from the auction as the largest refiner in Cleveland. But the refining business was dependent upon the anarchic production business. And the refiners were apparently no more capable of regulating their output than were the producers. Drastic measures were required to prevent the collapse of the entire industry. Unscrupulous measures. Rockefeller proved up to the task. His entire 25 years had prepared him for this Thurman Arnold moment. And fascinating to contrast Rockefeller's chaotic business life with his domestic life as he ventured his future on the turbulent oil business at age 25. Rockefeller's mother, Eliza, had married a diametric opposite. The result was disastrous. Rockefeller bore the scars of that disastrous marriage for the remainder of his life. He would not make the same mistake in his own marriage. Now, the young Rockefeller was awkward with women, but Laura Celestia Spellman, who was nicknamed Seti, who met John in Cleveland Central High School, saw something in him that other girls did not. He was ambitious, careful, and deferential to women. She admired his stoicism and his pluck when he was forced to leave school and search for a job in that torrid summer of 1855. But the Spellman family occupied a socioeconomic rank far above that of the Rockefellers in Cleveland, who, because of Bill's meanderings, were utterly unknown in the community. And so there was a 9-year hiatus between John's first meeting with Seti and their marriage in 1864. The Spellmans traced their lineage directly back to the Puritans, but they weren't stuffy. Seti's father was a member of the Ohio legislature. He was known for his philanthropic endeavors and was much admired as a self-made man. Spellman had started in a dry goods store in Akron, which is a community very near Cleveland. Eventually, he worked his way up to become a man of considerable wealth. The Spellmans were not only civil-minded, they were quite progressive in their views. Both of the Spellman parents were abolitionists and enthusiastically supported the temperance movement. They became a vital cog in the Underground Railroad during the Civil War. They were also very active in the Congregational Church, and their religious beliefs reinforced their progressive social and philanthropic activities. Well, SETI, having been raised in this environment, was a perfect fit for John D. Rockefeller. She was sensible and thrifty, as was he. She was soft-spoken. Her sister described her as, quote, gentle and lovely, but resolute, with an indomitable will. Her sister said of her, there was a persuasion in her touch as she laid her fingers ever so gently on your arm. But there was another trait that was perhaps even more important, making her a perfect match for the young Rockefeller. SETI's sister described her as a religieuse. Religion had come to dominate her life and her thinking as it had that of Rockefeller. She dressed in Quaker-like simplicity. Photos of her show a slim, pretty young woman in a black dress with a lace collar. Never anything fancier. A high school classmate described SETI thus. She exerted a strong influence upon the rest of us. For one thing, she didn't believe in dancing and theater going because she did not think it was proper for church people to engage in pursuits that she considered worldly. SETI was the valedictorian of her high school class, and she excelled in music, practicing the piano over 3 hours a day. She read voraciously in classic literature and poetry. The mild-mannered, soft-spoken SETI was also a very formidable person. She was tough. She would have to be to endure the controversy that was to surround John D. during the latter half of the century. She exhibited this toughness early on. When business was going badly for the Spellman family, and it did for a while, her parents were forced to move from Cleveland to Burlington, Iowa, to make a living. SETI and her sister stayed behind, became teachers in the Cleveland public schools in order to help boost the family finances. But things eased up 2 years later. They came back. SETI enrolled in Tweed Collegiate Institute in Worcester, Massachusetts, which was a school devoted to Christian learning and the reading of the classics. Perfect foil for Rockefeller. The college was noted for its support of such progressive causes as women's rights and black welfare, and SETI would ultimately become active in both. SETI was also very practical. She had taken business courses and was very much at home in financial books and records. In fact, while they were courting, John D. would often bring home his books of account and review them with her. He had great faith in her business judgment. Well, John D. pursued SETI Spellman just as he pursued other goals in his life. Remember, carefully, with much planning. He was in no rush. He was biding his time. Until the day that he learned that another suitor, somewhat more suave and cavalier than Rockefeller, was pursuing SETI. Decided then it was time to act. And he splurged on a $118 diamond engagement ring. He was, after all, a rising young businessman, a man of some substance. Profits were beginning to come in, and he wanted the Spellman family to know all about it. SETI accepted, and an afternoon marriage in the Spellman's living room followed a 6-month engagement. It took place in September 1864, just as Sherman marched into Atlanta. Typically, John had worked that morning. And just as typically, he reverted to type when he purchased a wedding ring for $15.75. The expenditure was then matter-of-factly entered in the ledger under the heading Sundry Expenses. Well, what then went on in the domestic life that followed this very practical courtship and marriage? Married life was Spartan. There were no frills, but there was no turbulence either. Rockefeller would soon own the largest refinery in Cleveland, but he and SETI had no servants. She insisted on doing the housework herself. SETI converted, became a devoted Baptist religieuse, as was John. The Baptist religion and culture came to dominate both of their domestic lives. They never went dancing. They never attended theater. They were not part of a club life in Cleveland. And the few dinners they did attend were only with church acquaintances and a small circle of family members. They were often in the company of ministers whose company they both enjoyed. Ironically, all of this was going on in the midst of the Gilded Age, that period following the Civil War when both social and business excesses abounded. SETI and John had carefully erected a barrier of calm that separated them from this environment. In a sense, during an age marked by exorbitance and debauchery, they were already a Victorian anachronism and they would remain so into the 20th century. John and Seti had 5 children. One died in infancy. The 3 girls who survived came first, then John Jr., born in 1874. Now, John D. was a model husband and father. He would get up when the babies cried, quiet them by carrying them up and down, patient with them, never losing his temper. He was, as ever, soft-spoken, just as she was. Although the children were denied many material things as part of the Rockefellers' strict Baptist religious code, they were never denied the companionship of their parents. John was determined that he would be there for them, just as Big Bill had not been there for him. John and Seti encouraged the children to enjoy music. Children, in fact, formed an instrumental quartet, played Beethoven and Mozart together. But the wealthier the Rockefellers became, the less the children were indulged. Sometimes the self-denial bordered on the absurd. For example, Seti would ask John Jr. what he wanted for Christmas, and then deliberately not get it for him in order to teach him self-denial. Poor John Jr. was forced to wear his sister's hand-me-down dresses until he was 8 years old. John and Seti bought just one tricycle for the 4 children. They could certainly afford many, many more. They wanted to teach the children to give up possessions to one another. To teach self-restraint, a significant tenet of the Rockefeller credo, each child was restricted to only 1 piece of cheese daily, and each child was required to keep accurate account books. The children lived in a make-believe market economy, where pocket money was earned for performing various household tasks. 2 cents for killing flies, 10 cents for sharpening pencils, 5 cents an hour for practicing music, and so on. They were taught Baptist values of abstinence, 2 cents a day for abstaining from candy. And if they abstained for 2 consecutive days, they received a 10-cent bonus. That's the way they were brought up. The family prayed each morning before breakfast. They would all have a turn to read scripture aloud, and they all recited their prayers before going to bed. The entire Rockefeller family attended Friday night prayer meetings together, and the children were encouraged to participate, just as did the adults, adding their own thoughts to the communal prayer sessions. Sunday was filled with religion, including Sunday school, morning prayers, afternoon prayers, evening hymns. If there was any extra time on Sunday, the children were encouraged to read the Bible, not extraneous literature. On Sunday, Seti would ask the children to reflect on such Baptist maxims as the secret of sensible living is simplicity. He who conquers self is the greatest victor. Or in the true tradition described by Max Weber, see thou a man diligent in business, he shall stand before kings. It was Baptist karma that although people were born in sin and flawed, they could overcome and improve themselves through prayer and sheer willpower, and of course, with God's grace. And Seti was intensely democratic. To her, all men were brothers. Conspicuous consumption was sinful. She disdained it. She sewed patches on her clothes and continued for many years to perform most household tasks herself. And thus did the increasingly wealthy John D. Rockefeller live in a calm domestic island amidst a raging sea of oil outside. Typically, he erected a barrier between the 2 worlds. His children were not allowed to visit the place of business until they were almost adults, and then only in the company of chaperones. While this was going on at home, the undisciplined world of oil, where John spent his days, was in turmoil. The turmoil Schumpeter described. Rockefeller determined that he must impose the order he enjoyed domestically on the untamed wilderness he encountered daily on the outside. Enter Henry Morrison Flagler. Henry Morrison Flagler was a dandy. He was 9 years Rockefeller's senior, son of a Presbyterian minister, and he had a religious upbringing. Notwithstanding this upbringing, or maybe because in spite of it, Henry Morrison Flagler became a ladies' man. He dressed something like Diamond Jim Brady and Boss Tweed, sporting a top hat, a diamond stick pin, a brocaded vest. Flagler, a true product of the Gilded Age, had at one time been quite successful in the whiskey business. But he lost his fortune and went bankrupt when he ventured into the salt business due to the severe drop in demand for salt following the Civil War. A few select salt producers, however, did survive. They did so by forming a cartel, Flagler had been frozen out, a lesson he would never forget, and a lesson that Rockefeller would now learn under Flagler's tutelage. Well, Rockefeller met Henry Morrison Flagler in 1867, just 3 years after the infamous auction trap. Ironically, the diametric opposite, Flagler, was to become John D. Rockefeller's closest friend, business associate, confidant. Rockefeller did not meet Flagler by chance. Flagler was thrust upon him by a wealthy financier named Stephen Harkness, gave a lot of money to Harvard. As a condition of lending Rockefeller's fledgling refinery much needed capital to expand, Harkness had insisted that Flagler be brought in to oversee his investment. Flagler's influence on Rockefeller was profound. Together, Rockefeller and Flagler set about to control the chaotic oil market in two ways: through railroad rebates and through cartels. In the process, they would both ultimately garner untold wealth. But at the same time, they would both become two of the most hated men in the country. Here's how it happened. Oil production had skyrocketed just as demand slowed following the Civil War. In Cleveland, myriads of small refiners were generating product whenever the Titusville wildcatters found oil, regardless of the overall demand. Resultantly, the price of oil had dropped to a fraction of what it had been in the 1860s. And yet, new refineries were still being built. Rockefeller suspected that many large and small refineries were in trouble, and now would be a good time to buy them at fire sale prices. Well, what did he do? When John Alexander, one of his largest competitors, offered to sell out to him for 10 cents on a dollar, his suspicions were confirmed. But an industry-wide solution to the supply and demand problem was needed. An agreement was needed between the largest producers to limit production and head off disaster. The largest oil refiners could survive, Flagler told Rockefeller, only if they formed a cartel and controlled supply, just as the surviving salt producers had after the Civil War. But this would take money. With massive infusions of capital, Rockefeller and Flagler could force the smaller refiners and even the larger ones like Alexander to sell out, most cases at a fraction of their net worth. But Rockefeller's lines of credit were already stretched to the limit. He could borrow no more without jeopardizing his credit lines. The solution they arrived at was to form a joint stock company, in effect, to sell equity. Not only could the stock be used to attract investment capital, it could be bartered to acquire refining companies. The approach, join us or be left out in the cold. So it was that the Rockefeller and Andrews firm was now transformed in the year 1870 into a new corporation, the Standard Oil Company of Ohio. What did Standard Oil consist of at its inception? First, with capital of $1 million, Standard Oil already had the largest capitalization of any U.S. company. Second, due to the foresight and tight financial controls of its former bookkeeper, president, John D. Rockefeller, Standard Oil owned its own barrel-making facility, its own tank cars, and its own shipping facilities to complement its refineries. Remember, he was in the shipping business first. He knew it cold. With this formidable combination in capital in the bank, Rockefeller and Flagler set about to buy up the surrounding refineries. But they ran into resistance. Many of the refiners in and around Cleveland were independent, self-made men with a stubborn wildcat mentality, just like the producers. In the post-Civil War era, it wasn't too difficult to set up a refinery. The equipment required was rather basic, not expensive, and many farmers, mechanics, and others ventured into the business in and around Cleveland, just as the wildcat producers had descended on Titusville in the 1860s. These refiners were proprietary, and they resisted selling out even though they were losing money. Something more was needed to shock them into submission, to force them, for their own good, into becoming part of the Standard Oil family. That something fell into Rockefeller and Flagler's lap in 1872. It led to what became known as the Cleveland Massacre, and it made Rockefeller the dark man of American industry. It was the phenomenon of the railroad rebate, and it happened like this. Tom Scott, not unlike Flagler, was a dashing fellow. He had long curling side whiskers and he wore an enormous felt hat. Scott was a formidable power in the railroad industry. He gained his prestige and power during the Civil War. Lincoln loved him by managing to keep the trains running from the north to Washington. No mean feat during the Civil War. This commendable service on the side of the Union landed Scott an appointment as Assistant Secretary of War in the Lincoln administration. Following the war, he emerged as the czar of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Well, Scott was not only dashing, he was shrewd. He knew his way around government. He had mastered the art of political manipulation, a necessity in the railroad business dominated at the time by the Vanderbilts, the J.P. Morgans, and the Jay Goulds of this world. Author Alan Nevins quotes a contemporary of Scott as having described Scott's political magnetism in this way, quote, "As he trailed his garments across the country, the members of 20 legislatures rustled like dry leaves in a winter's wind." That was Scott. Rockefeller would eventually come to despise Scott as an autocrat. But in 1871, when Peter Watson, an official of a rival railroad, brought him an overture from Scott proposing a meeting in New York among the leading refiners of the day and the three railroads serving the oil patch to discuss common interest, Rockefeller was quick to accept. On November 30th, 1871, at the St. Nicholas Hotel in New York, Scott proposed a brazen scheme. The three railroads, the Pennsylvania under Scott, the New York Central, Vanderbilt, and the Erie, Jay Gould and Jim Fisk, had already banded together to form a company with a misleading title, the South Improvement Company, or the SIC. The Pennsylvania legislature following the Civil War had chartered many so-called improvement companies by special legislation endowing them with broad, vaguely defined powers, including the right to hold stock in companies outside of Pennsylvania. These were valuable rights at the time. Under Scott's plan, cut directly from the Thurman Arnold mold, the SIC would immediately double freight rates for all refiners. Then, for the chosen few, such as Standard Oil, they would secretly rebate 50% of the freight paid. But the plot didn't stop there. It was even more devious. As a bonus, the SIC would then pay to the select few refiners in on the scheme what was known as a drawback. This was an additional rebate based on all the shipments made by all the other refiners, those outside the pack. Today, we would call this a commercial bribe, a crime in most states. In consideration for this largesse, the refiners would promise to meet certain quotas and to confine their shipments to chosen railroads within the SIC. A key element of this scheme was a reliance on Standard Oil, on Rockefeller, to be an evener among the three railroads to ensure that each received a fair proportion of the shipping business. An evener? Think among whom he was an evener. Who were these three railroads involved? The Erie was run by Jim Fisk and Jay Gould. The New York Central was run by Commodore Vanderbilt, their arch rival, every bit as cunning, every bit as vicious. And the Pennsylvania run, of course, by Tom Scott, the devil who organized this SIC. All sharks. All unscrupulous Thurman Arnold prototypes who violated most of the principles we cherish. And the primus inter pares, the first among equals in these shark-filled waters, was the evener, John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller was elected the alpha shark. Did Rockefeller, with his deep religious convictions, denounce this scheme as the work of the devil? Did it offend his sense of morality and fair play? Hardly. He jumped at the opportunity. His rationale was simple. Both the railroads and the refiners were in the process of self-destructing. The railroads were in a fight to the death over slashing rates to attract business. The refiners had no restraint on their excess production. So Rockefeller perceived in an instant that they could create, in essence, two cartels with one move on the chessboard and basically checkmate his refining competitors for their own good. At the same time, he could save the railroads from devouring themselves. It was all a beautifully crafted scheme from which everybody would prosper. Everybody, that is, except the thousands of producer and refiner proprietors and employees who would lose their jobs. As negotiations in New York continued over days and weeks, ironing out the details among these sharks, a number of refiners grew restless and began to have doubts. particularly about the explosive reaction from the oil industry if this pact with the devil were ever uncovered. But Rockefeller was the calming force. It was for everyone's good, he contended. They'd see. And it was to be their secret, a Rockefeller trait, remember? Only a select few producers and refiners and a select few railroads would ever know, unless, of course, they broke ranks. But when the pact was finally signed, in late January 1872, it didn't remain their secret very long. Although a trade paper had warned of a rumored scheme to control freight rates as early as February of 1872, confirmations of its suspicions happened quite by accident. A local freight agent of the Lakeshore Railroad rushed off to visit a dying son, and he left a subordinate, neophyte, in charge. The minor functionary jumped the gun, charged the as yet unadopted freight rates to all but the members of the chosen group. When the other refiners woke up and realized that their rates had more than doubled, except to the chosen few, all hell broke loose. There were protest meetings, torchlight parades, burnings in effigy, violence in the oil country. On the night of February 27th, 3,000 people flocked into the Titusville Opera House, shouting, waving banners, denouncing the conspirators, likening them to a giant anaconda. The producers then formed a trade organization called the Petroleum Producers Union to fight the SIC. And they elected as its head a fiery speaker named John D. Archbold. Archbold, the son of a preacher, vowed to retaliate by selling product only to the refiners who were not included in the SIC pact. During the later torchlight parades in and around Oil City, the Producers Union threatened to cut production by 30%, to stop drilling for 30 days, to control pricing. Ironically, it was this same Archbold who will ultimately become a member of the Standard Oil Inner Circle, confident that John D. Rockefeller, and a member of his executive committee. He became one of the closest associates of John D. Rockefeller, sat next to Flagler at executive meetings. My mother-in-law used to say, there's nobody as self-righteous as a reformed whore. Basically, that's what happened here. Prior to this, John D. Rockefeller was a virtual unknown. He lived in the shadows, shunned publicity. Nobody knew about him. But during these meetings, the name John D. Rockefeller now surfaced as a target. He became the eminence grise, the villain whom the producers and refiners would center on as the principal architect of this hideous venture. A scheme that now threatened the livelihood of thousands of small independent producers and their employees, and refiners and their employees. Rockefeller was denounced as the Mephistopheles of Cleveland. Violent incidents now occurred with regularity. Standard Oil's easily recognizable blue barrels were vandalized, defaced with skull and crossbones, other graffiti, blown up. Standard Oil employees in Oil City were forced to barricade themselves in their offices to avoid being torn apart by angry mobs. They were in constant dread that Standard Oil's tanks would be set afire. Railroads were attacked, tracks were torn up, oil cars were ransacked, and Standard's oil was spilled out all over the countryside. It is certain that none of those protesting had any idea that the man they were vilifying and characterizing as the force behind this hydra-headed monster was a mild-mannered, soft-spoken Sunday school teacher from Cleveland, Ohio. Rockefeller's reaction to the sudden surge of negative publicity, however, remained silent. How could Rockefeller remain indifferent throughout this period? How could a religieuse rationalize the merciless destruction of countless families and their livelihoods? Rockefeller would later explain that by remaining silent, he felt he would confirm his integrity, that the public and the industry would eventually come to see that what he did was for the good of all, that he was Moses in the wilderness, leading an aimless flock to the promised land of controlled supply. As the violence intensified, so did his missionary fervor. The Margaret turbulence merely confirmed him in his own judgment that the producers were a disorganized mob of amateur speculators, toughs who could not succeed elsewhere. Most of them had blundered into the production of oil, he figured, as a last resort. They could no more control their output than they could control themselves. He, Rockefeller, and only Rockefeller, could lead them. Surely they would eventually see that. His business tactics were now sheathed in the religious fervor of Christian morality, as he himself became ever more insular. Characteristically, the more threatening things became, the cooler and more silent Rockefeller became. But to the outside world, his silence and his secretiveness made him seem sinister, arrogant, callous. From this point on in his career, he was to endure massive criticism, becoming eventually the most reviled man in the country. But he defied his critics. He ignored them, just as Eliza had ignored the vile gossip of her neighbors when Big Bill was away. The public reaction, however, was severe and was having its effect on Standard Oil and the railroad conspirators. The petroleum producers under Archbold's leadership had effectively stopped shipments of oil to the SIC members. They lobbied the Harrisburg legislature to annul the SIC charter, and they presented Congress with a 93-foot-long scroll of signatures demanding an investigation. Rockefeller at one point was forced to temporarily lay off 90% of his employees. The pressure on the railroads from all sides became unbearable. Finally, on March 25th, they dissolved the SIC contract, ended all rebates, and reverted to a uniform rate for all shippers. But it was a Pyrrhic victory for these refiners and for these producers. Volume discounts were now made available to all shippers, not just a chosen few. They'd done away with the drawbacks, but volume discounts were now available. This alternative, of course, favored Standard Oil, which is by far the largest shipper in the Cleveland area. At this point in our history, there were no antitrust laws. There was no Interstate Commerce Commission. That came in 1887, and the Antitrust Act in 1890. So there was nothing to regulate the railroads, and technically the SIC conspiracy didn't violate anything but inherent sense of right and the spirit of free enterprise that many felt. Thus Rockefeller, a genuinely pious man who practiced self-denial in private life almost to an absurdity, came to symbolize unbounded greed and became the Antichrist in many thousands of homes where men were losing their jobs and their businesses, driving many into bankruptcy, a number into suicide. It was a stigma the Rockefeller family would fight to reverse for generations to come. It was a stigma that John and Seti characteristically bore in silence during their lifetimes. Although the SIC had been forced to disband before its diabolical double rate scheme ever materialized in practice, the threat of it had a numbing effect on the refiners in and around Cleveland. It had done its job. Ironically, the scheme that never came to fruition actually began to have its desired effect. It benefited Standard Oil by intimidating the Cleveland refiners to begin selling out for both cash and stock in Standard Oil. And the eventual breakup of the SIC merely served to reinforce Standard's dominating position. In 1872, Standard Oil began in earnest to seek out these Cleveland refiners and to impress upon them the fact that their position in the industry was hopeless unless they sold out and took Standard Oil stock. But first, Rockefeller himself approached his major competitor in the Cleveland area, Colonel Oliver Payne, and he offered to bring him into the Standard Oil community. Now note the similarities between what happened here and that auction where he overpaid. Payne demanded to see the Standard Oil books. Rockefeller cheerfully obliged. Payne was stunned. The profits were far in excess of what Payne could imagine, even on comparable volume. The colonel readily agreed to be bought out for $400,000. It was a major sum in those days and far more than a fair price. But Rockefeller knew that the effect of the deal on the many small refiners in the area would be devastating, and it was. What followed the capitulation of Colonel Payne was an onslaught by Standard Oil on a segment of American industry that has never been paralleled. The so-called Cleveland Massacre resulted in no fewer than 22 refineries being taken over by Standard in Cleveland in a very short time span. Ruthless Standard Oil operatives would accomplish this in devious ways. They would approach the helpless Cleveland refiners in the first instance with an olive branch rather than with a sword. They characterized Standard Oil as a charitable institution. You're suffering. You really can't compete. The market's in disarray. You're at the mercy of undisciplined producers, avaricious railroads. Standard is an angel of mercy. Let us take you out of your misery. Here, look at our books. Can you refine crude oil this cheaply? Do you have the volume to ship it at comparable rates? Join us, don't fight us. Anyway, it's hopeless. And do your family a favor, protect their future. Take Standard Oil stock instead of cash. By the way, some did and became millionaires. If all this were true, if Standard Oil were saving the doomed refiners who were on the edge of financial disaster, why was Standard Oil portrayed in such a demonic way? The answer lies in the tactics which followed the proffered olive branch. If the initial peaceful approach failed, Standard Oil simply lowered its prices in the target refiners' territories until it would squeeze them into surrender or financial ruin. Not many smaller refiners could hold out for very long against such cutthroat tactics. Since the refiners, many of them were in the red, Rockefeller's agents often offered them only a small fraction of what their families had invested in plant and equipment. Goodwill counted for nothing. Many plants could have been auctioned off for scrap for more than Standard offered them. And in fact, Rockefeller actually did shut down many and auctioned them off for scrap. He never lost sight of his overarching objective, which was to control supply. Since there were no antitrust laws in effect, Rockefeller could force sellers to sign restrictive covenants, prohibiting them from re-entering the oil business. And he enforced these rigorously at a time when the courts would construe these covenants liberally in favor of Standard Oil. Rockefeller's purchases had the desired effect. In a business that was capital intensive, Rockefeller realized that the key to success was economy of scale. And as Standard's volume increased and the volume of his collective competitors shrank through acquisition, Standard was able to control refining activity and pricing and actually did moderate the wild fluctuations which had nearly destroyed the industry immediately following the Civil War. So he accomplished his objective. But the climate in which Rockefeller operated was one of collective paranoia, especially in and around Cleveland. His operatives, far from being hailed as angel mercies, were reviled as unscrupulous thugs, as they were, all in the Thurman Arnold mold. Cleveland society was an upheaval. Once stately homes along Euclid Avenue, major thoroughfare in Cleveland, were on the auction block. A number fell into disrepair. Blue-collar employees of many former independent refiners were out of work. Whether these refiners would eventually have had to shut down because of the imbalance between production and demand, possibly so. That'll never be known. Quite possibly, many would have had to shut down. But one thing was for certain. There were numerous losers in this game, and only one big winner. The hatred which that disproportion generated is incalculable. Rockefeller's friends were now entirely confined to close family and church parishioners, ministers, and his home and his family were now guarded around the clock. Having conquered the Cleveland market, Rockefeller turned his attention to Pennsylvania. The representatives of Standard Oil were ruthless in their forays into the oil market there and subsequently in other states as well. The stories of their brutality are legion. They would invade an area, drastically underprice their product till the competition simply collapsed. Often they would forbid retailers to carry competitors' products at the risk of losing their supply of Standard Oil product. Or in the alternative, they would threaten to finance a retailer's competitor. Or they would simply buy up all the barrels in the area. So it was impossible for the target competitor to ship. Standard, of course, had its own barrel manufacturing facility and could produce an unending supply. All of Rockefeller's thrifty, cost-cutting, youthful experiences were now brought to bear on Standard's oil refining business. One example. Rockefeller noticed a workman soldering lids on cans of oil as the last stage in the process before they were shipped out. "How many drops of solder are used?" he said. 40, the worker replied. 38 do it? The worker tried. 38 didn't quite make it, but 39 did. And Rockefeller ordered the one-drop decrease and later proudly announced that this cost-cutting measure saved the company $2,500 in the first year alone, and more, of course, as volume increased. One drop of solder. Standard Oil was so successful that by 1879, it controlled 90% of the refinery and pipeline business in western Pennsylvania. The railroads were by this time so dependent upon Standard's business that Rockefeller essentially controlled freight rates as well. During the Pennsylvania campaign, he now recruited to the cause of Standard Oil 27-year-old John Archbold, that fiery orator who had whipped up such rage against him when the SIC conspiracy was uncovered in 1872. Since Rockefeller was afraid to show his face in and around Titusville and Oil City, Archbold was to become Rockefeller's alter ego among the refiners and producers in western Pennsylvania. Archbold, later a significant member of Standard's executive committee, acquired many of the oil refiners in western Pennsylvania for Standard Oil through a front company called the Acme Oil Refining Company. Rockefeller also covertly moved in on the oil refiners in West Virginia, New Jersey, Maryland. By 1879, still in his 30s, Rockefeller was the sole monarch of American oil refining. Since oil had been discovered only in western Pennsylvania and Russia, at the time he alone held a virtual monopoly on the world's kerosene supply. Standard's operations were now so diverse geographically, and foreign export had become so much a part of the business, that Rockefeller found himself attending more and more meetings in New York City, primary port on the East Coast. His executives finally made it clear to him it was imperative. Either he moved to New York City, or they would have to move to Cleveland, God forbid. Rockefeller capitulated, moved to New York, and eventually the corporation established offices at 26 Broadway in the Wall Street area. True to type, Rockefeller, one of the richest men in the country, commuted by trolley for 6 cents from his brownstone at 6 West 54th Street, entering his office very silently at 9 o'clock sharp and meeting for lunch with his staff every day. Characteristically, Rockefeller did not sit at the head of the table. He ceded this honor to others, such as Charlie Pratt, who was the group's oldest member. Next to him sat Henry Flagler, Rockefeller's closest confidant and associate, and then John Archbold, the convert. Self-effacing Rockefeller would sit unobtrusively somewhere in the middle. In 1882, Standard Oil, which had now formed corporations in numerous jurisdictions, was faced with a new dilemma. There was no federal incorporation statute, couldn't incorporate as a federal company. A corporation could only exist by virtue of a state charter. But a state-chartered corporation could only own property within its own state. Standard Oil of Ohio could not own refineries outside of Ohio, but it was rapidly acquiring pipelines and refineries in many other states. Rockefeller had no way to legally manage this interstate operation, as there was a strictly enforced prohibition against corporations holding stock in other corporations. You couldn't have a corporate holding company without a special act of the legislature, and the procedure for obtaining these special acts of the legislature was rife with corruption, and Rockefeller was loath to play this political game. What to do? Rockefeller retained a brilliant Presbyterian elder named C.T. Dodd to figure a way out of this labyrinth. Attorney Dodd was a very genial man. When I was a kid, there was a popular song called Mr. 5x5. Maybe some of you remember it. Well, that was C.T. Dodd. He was rotund, so rotund that he was once described as the same size in every direction. But the rotund Dodd possessed the uncanny ability to devise structures which adhered strictly to the letter of the law and at the same time trampled the spirit of the law, just the fit that Standard needed. Dodd, by the way, was born and raised in Titusville, Pennsylvania, and was originally one of the advocates for the producers. Dodd's solution was to form state corporations such as Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of New York, Standard Oil of Ohio, to issue stock to Rockefeller and a certain few trusted Standard Oil executives, and then place their stock ownership in the trust. No one corporation would own any other corporation, thus adhering technically to the prohibition against corporate holding companies. But the owner of each corporation would be the same entity, the trust. A trust is a very flexible instrument. It separates the legal ownership of property from the beneficial ownership of that same property. The trustees control the trust, which in turn control the corporations. The chosen trustees were in effect the Standard Oil Executive Committee, which met for lunch with Rockefeller each day, 26 Broadway. The control was centralized. The dividends and appreciation in value, that is, the beneficial interest, were passed through by the trust to the individual stockholders. The law had been complied with, no corporation owned any other corporation, and the unwieldy monolith could legally be controlled. That monolith, incidentally, was now a $70 million enterprise of which the public as yet knew nothing. Now, this is before the Sherman Antitrust Act, and it was one of the major motivating factors of the Sherman Antitrust Act, 1890. The trust agreement was prepared by C.T. Dodd and Flagler and was signed in 1882. It proved to be the precursor of many similar cartel agreements in many other industries. When the details became public, the negative reaction of monopoly control became the stimulus which led to the enactment of the Sherman Act. 8 years later, the Sherman Antitrust Act made it illegal for any corporation or group of corporations acting in concert through a trust, form of ownership, or any other form of ownership to interfere with or restrain interstate commerce or foreign trade. And before it came the Interstate Commerce Act in 1887, which sought to regulate rates and prohibit the rebate phenomenon. Rockefeller's activity with the railroad rebates had already been a stimulus to the Interstate Commerce Act in 1887. That, by the way, was brought about by a group of workers known as the Granger movement, because the farmers were significantly affected by the freight rate differentials. The activities of Rockefeller and Standard Oil, which had been hidden from public view for many years, were coming to the forefront of public opinion. And the picture that the public was receiving was that of this hydra-headed anaconda run by a secretive, hidden, evil genius like the Wizard of Oz. Certain writers in particular emerged as implacable foes of Standard Oil. The writings of one in particular, Ida Tarbell, shocked and mesmerized the public. Tarbell was raised in Titusville. As a young girl, witnessed firsthand the brutality of Standard Oil operatives who had destroyed her father's business. She was not only bitter, she was articulate, and she was clever, and she was a friend of Mark Twain. As a young writer, she met him, befriended him, and he in turn introduced her to a senior Standard Oil executive. Unsuspecting executive willingly gave extended interviews to Tarbell about Standard Oil. Well, what emerged was a graphic depiction of how Standard Oil insidiously destroyed the lives of thousands of hardworking, God-fearing American workmen and entrepreneurs. Tarbell's book, which appeared in serial form in the Atlantic Monthly, then in book form, was widely read by an outraged American public. Theodore Roosevelt, as governor of New York, had turned his attention to the menace of monopolies. His public statements on the subject of the inequities of trusts were so well received by the public that the Republican powers to be decided to bury him politically. So they nominated him as vice president. They succeeded in getting him elected to serve quietly under William McKinley, a faithful and trusted conservative. Mark Hanna would run the country. Mark Hanna wired McKinley on the day he was elected, "God is in his heaven, all's right with the world." Well, McKinley was promptly assassinated. The indictment of Standard Oil under the Sherman Act was now inevitable. The indictment sought to prove that Standard Oil, by use of rebates and by price fixing, had tried to destroy all refiners of crude oil and distributors of petroleum products. The trial, held in St. Louis, lasted 2 years, called 444 witnesses, presented 1,371 exhibits, and consumed 14,495 transcript pages. Rockefeller testified at length. He was unflappable. He made an excellent witness, but to no avail. The court found Standard Oil to be in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act and ordered it to be broken up within 6 months. The Supreme Court upheld the verdict with these potent words: "No disinterested mind can survey the period since 1870 without being irresistibly drawn to the conclusion that the very genius for commercial development and organization soon begat an intent and purpose to exclude others from their right to trade." But fortune smiled upon Rockefeller. Standard Oil was broken up by the courts just as the automobile, thanks to Henry Ford's mass production techniques, was becoming a major factor in our economy. The market for oil had evolved. Automobiles, not kerosene lighting, were now becoming the driving market force. And the market was growing exponentially, so much so that the single Muller list, the trust, would not have been flexible enough to handle it. The 7 companies into which Standard Oil was broken in 1911 are now all household words, and they all thrived. Standard Oil of New York became Mobil. Standard Oil of New Jersey, Exxon. Standard of California, Chevron. Standard of Indiana is now Amoco. Standard of Ohio, of course, Ohio. Continental Oil became Conoco, and Atlantic Oil was transformed into both Arco and Sun. All were successful and undoubtedly would not have thrived had they not been separate entities. The aggressive young executives who ran these corporations were no longer duty-bound to report to 26 Broadway. In fact, they were now forbidden by law from doing so. That would have been a criminal act, an act of collusion in restraint of trade. So the young entrepreneurs no longer needed permission of their elders, as they had before, to authorize expenditures in excess of $5,000. They were now free to experiment and explore new methods and territories. The freedom to operate proved liberating and a boon to their entrepreneurship, and these companies thrived. In the breakup, shareholders of Standard Oil received stock in all of the new companies. Those who held the stock became multimillionaires many times over. Among them, of course, was John D. Rockefeller. His implicit faith in Standard Oil had now made him the wealthiest man in the world. Well, Rockefeller retired from active participation in the workplace in 1898. Now involved himself in philanthropic activities on a scale larger than any previously witnessed in this country. His philanthropic endeavors surpassed even the extraordinary endowments of Andrew Carnegie. Rockefeller's scientists rooted out the boll weevil so that depressed Southern farmers could now fend for themselves and regain their self-esteem. They cured hookworm in the South in the early 1900s, an effort that was acclaimed the most effective campaign against a widespread disabling disease which medical science and philanthropy has ever devised. Other scientists funded by Rockefeller would discover a cure for malaria. When the Rockefeller Foundation was first established in 1901, the Ida Tarbell polemic was enjoying a large readership. The antitrust case was playing out in the courts, and the foundation was attacked as merely a disguised attempt to influence the case. When the foundation was finally given a charter in New York in 1913, Rockefeller had already contributed $157 million to various philanthropic endeavors. He contributed another $100 million in the first year of the foundation's existence alone. In 1919, he had added another $87 million, and by his death in 1937, at age 98, another $180 million. John Jr. would eventually add another $1 billion. Rockefeller Philanthropies founded both the University of Chicago, the Rockefeller University of New York, and contributed hundreds of millions of dollars to medical research. Rockefeller's contributions were so substantial that on his death in 1937, his entire personal estate was valued at only $26 million. He had given the rest away, billions. He was buried in Cleveland alongside his mother, Eliza, and his wife, Seti, in a tomb which, notwithstanding his extraordinary philanthropy, had been ominously made bomb-proof with heavy stone. Cleveland had not forgotten. The summing up of the life of this man is a daunting assignment. He was surely one of the great organizational geniuses in the history of the world of business, thus fulfilling the first part of Thurman Arnold's postulate. But what of the second half of the postulate? Was he unscrupulous? Did Rockefeller violate most of the principles which we cherish? Surely the Cleveland Massacre and what followed it in Pennsylvania and the rest of the Eastern Seaboard fit these criteria like a glove. But Rockefeller, out of self-defense, developed the capacity to rationalize what he did in terms of his faith. He had to. What his minions did was merciless and contemptuous. So Rockefeller justified his attack on the free market capitalist system as an attempt to save it from itself. From interviews he gave to William O. Inglis when he was under severe attack both legally and in the public press, it is evident that Rockefeller had struggled to develop a theoretical justification for monopoly as beneficial to industries such as petroleum. This is not a subject which is completely free and clear. He told Inglis It was the battle of the new idea of cooperation against competition. And perhaps in no department of business, said Rockefeller, was there a greater necessity for this cooperation than in the oil business. But it was also evident that the insular Rockefeller had made himself impervious to the pain and humiliation which Standard's industrial genocide had imposed on thousands. Adam Smith's supply and demand model, the so-called invisible hand, hadn't worked to shut down overcapacity. Failing refiners, defying Smith's economic model, continued to plod on in a desperate attempt to postpone bankruptcy. The formless industry had to be led to redemption. There was nothing unique or even novel about this concept. The Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter, for one, toyed with the idea that monopolies might prove useful by imposing stability during depressions or during the rapid shifting of industries in his book Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. Schumpeter also argued that under capitalism, the idea of a permanent monopoly is ludicrous, especially in manufacturing. In an essay on monopoly, Alan Greenspan echoed the very same thoughts in 1961. Perversely, in his attempt to control production and hence price, Rockefeller anticipated the coming of OPEC in that very industry in which he toiled. But Rockefeller's faith impelled him to find a divine justification for his action. His interview with Inglis in 1910 is replete with missionary phraseology. God gave me my money. God had chosen Rockefeller for the task. Otherwise, he reasoned, why would he have succeeded so remarkably? Was this simply hypocrisy? Was it simply a reaching out to find a religious rationale to justify limitless greed? If it were greed, was it lust after material possessions? Remember, John and Seti, in the tradition of Weber's Protestant ethic, lived an ascetic life, one of simplicity, one of self-denial. Their private life was filled with Sunday school mentoring, prayer, and meditation. Both John and Seti lived and taught their own children that there was a religious duty to give back all that God had given one to the betterment of one's fellow man. So what is it that impelled him? I don't purport to have a complete answer to this complexity. Certainly Weber's answer is a factor, the entrepreneurialism of the calling. It's all right to accumulate wealth. But perhaps an equally important part of the solution lies in that haunting picture of the terrified young Rockefeller and his mother living on the edge of the eastern wilderness, fearful of financial ruin in an age when debtors were still imprisoned, being forced to incur debt for months at a time, never knowing whether the family would starve or freeze to death in the small towns of upper New York State, waiting endlessly for Big Bill to return. And when he finally did return, with pockets bulging, there was this overwhelming sense of relief and rejoicing. His return was literally a life-saving experience. And their salvation was now associated with the arrival of money. It was all a rather curious blend. The terrifying eastern wilderness, the unquestioning religious faith, the stoic mother, the absent bigamous father, all become factors in nurturing one of the most cruel, financially successful, generous, and sphinx-like figures in the history of the American economy, John D. Rockefeller. Thank you.